In the dark corridors of the imperial palace of Luoyang, the stench of death lingered in the air. This was no accident. It was the signature of Zetian, one of the most sadistic figures in all of history. Behind silken curtains, her enemies were dismembered. In wine barrels, their bodies dissolved. Ministers screamed beneath the palace floors, their bones shattered one by one, as the Empress watched in silence. Her cruelty knew no bounds, not even blood, because the final poison came from the one person she never expected, her own daughter. But this was only the beginning, because what Zetian would go on to do would surpass everything humanity had ever known. In cruelty, before we dive deeper into this dark tale, I want to hear from you. What time is it where you are right now? And where are you listening from? Drop your answers in the comments. I'll be reading your messages and sharing some of them in the next video. Your voices make this journey alive. So, tell me, what's the time where you listen to these stories of shadows and power? Wu Zhao was not born in blood. She was born in silk. The year was 624. Her father was a wealthy timber merchant in Shaanxi, not a nobleman, but close enough to afford tutors. While other girls embroidered peonies, Wu memorized state philosophy and war strategy. She wasn't raised like a future wife. She was raised like a future emperor, which, in hindsight, should have worried someone. At 14, she was summoned to the palace as a concubine of Emperor Taizong, one of many, chosen for her beauty, dismissed for her intelligence. But Wu played the long game. She learned which ministers drank too much, which servants whispered secrets, and how to make herself invisible until she no longer needed to be. When Taizong died, she was sent to a convent, her head shaved, her name erased, as tradition demanded. A quiet retirement for used imperial toys. But Wu Zhao didn't do quiet. She seduced the next emperor, Taizong's own son, Gaozong, and returned to court, still dressed in mourning robes, but smiling. Her rivals called her a ghost. They weren't wrong, because from that moment on, death followed her like a shadow. One concubine fell ill, another tripped and miscarried. The Empress herself, Lady Wang, accused Wu of murdering her own baby, an infant daughter. Wu, of course, was devastated. She wept. She collapsed. She performed grief like an opera singer. And then, she accused Lady Wang in return. Lady Wang was found guilty. Of course, she was stripped of her title, beaten with iron rods, and tossed into a wine vat to die slowly, which some might say was a bit over the top for a custody dispute. Wu Zhao became Empress, and the executions had only just begun. As soon as Wu Zetian crowned herself Empress, the only woman in Chinese history to do so officially, she began turning the imperial palace from a place of ceremony into a den of death. Her court was no longer about pageantry or politeness. It became a calculated machine of fear and bloodlust, where every silk curtain hid a secret and every shadow could be your last. Her first priority was simple and brutal: eliminate anyone who still remembered her as just a concubine. Servants disappeared overnight without a trace. Eunuchs were found floating lifeless in palace wells, their eyes wide in eternal terror. One high-ranking official, summoned to her chambers, reportedly chose death over disgrace and hanged himself with his own sash. His last written words were chillingly laconic: "I know what I did." She knows it too. These were not random acts of cruelty. They were carefully designed to send a message. But these were just appetizers. Wu Zetian was only beginning her feast. In the shadowed corridors of the imperial palace, where silence was never peace, but a prelude to horror, the old order was drowning in a bloody decadence orchestrated by Wu Zetian. Empress Wang, the woman who once held the throne, was shown no mercy. No graceful exile, no quiet retirement awaited her. Wu's revenge was ruthless, meticulously planned, and unimaginably cruel. Following a sham trial designed to defile her name and strip her of honor, Wang was arrested alongside her loyal ally, the favored concubine Xiao. Once powerful and feared, these women were reduced to prey in the gruesome theater of imperial vengeance. stripped naked upon their arrest, a humiliation intended to expose their vulnerability and erase any remaining dignity. They were paraded before the court as broken figures. This act alone sent a chilling message. No protection remained, not even that of modesty. Under the relentless gaze of guards, they were brutally beaten with wooden sticks, each strike echoing through their bruised and shattered bodies. Their flesh became a canvas painted with pain and submission. Yet this was only the prelude. On Wu Zetian's direct orders, their limbs were severed, arms and legs meticulously amputated in a calculated display of sadism designed to prolong suffering. Reduced to mutilated torsos, the two women were left as living shadows of their former selves. But the cruelty did not end there. Their battered torsos were shoved into massive wine barrels filled with potent rice wine. Vessels normally reserved for celebration, now turned into grotesque coffins. Sealed tightly, these barrels were left to bake beneath the scorching sun of Luoyang in the very courtyard of the palace. The sun's merciless heat transformed the contents into a macabre fermentation, blending human decay with the pungent sting of alcohol. Though many Tang Dynasty court records have since been lost or censored, surviving biographies whisper that weeks later, when the barrels were finally opened, what remained defied description. Witnesses spoke of a viscous, disturbing liquid, described as half wine, half women, a haunting testament to the Empress's merciless reign. Legend has it that Wu Zetian walked past these barrels every morning on her way to prayers, unfazed by the fetid stench of rot. Some say she regarded them as a dark masterpiece, a symbol of absolute power, that even in death, her enemies served her. This grotesque tableau captured the twisted blend of imperial luxury and barbarity under Wu's rule, where elegance masked the darkest cruelty and power was preserved in the most chilling of vintages. Wu Zetian's reign was not merely ruled by swords and daggers, but by a pervasive atmosphere of psychological terror. The court was a crucible where the smallest misstep, the faintest gesture, could be twisted into a capital crime. Chancellor Zhongsun Wuji, a nobleman whose family had served the empire for generations, found himself ensnared in this web of paranoia. A man known for his wisdom and steady hand, Zhongsun made one fatal, human error during one of Wu Zetian's fiery speeches. He coughed. In any normal court, a cough would be a mundane interruption, a mere bodily reflex. But in Wu's court, it was read as a challenge, a sign of disrespect, perhaps even a coded insult to the Empress herself. Wu Zetian, ever the master of concealment, offered only a polite smile in response, her eyes cold and unreadable. Behind that calm exterior lurked a deadly intent. 3 days later, without a shred of real evidence, Zhongsun was accused of treason. The charges were fabricated, the verdict preordained. His punishment was a public spectacle of humiliation and degradation. Draped in the skin of a dog, the ultimate symbol of disgrace and subhuman status, he was forced to parade through the capital's streets, mocked by the very people who once revered him. But exile followed this public shaming. Zhongsun was sent to the remote and harsh mountain regions, far from the gilded halls of power. It was not long before news arrived that he had died of regret, a phrase loaded with euphemism, signaling a forced suicide whispered about behind closed doors. To Wu Zetian, this was justice served. To the court and the empire, it was a grim warning. In this realm, even the slightest cough could seal your fate. As the courtiers whispered in fearful tones, a saying took hold. Better to choke on your fear than on your phlegm. In a calculated and deeply symbolic move, Wu Zetian uprooted the imperial capital from the ancient city of Chang'an to Luoyang. Officially, this was framed as a strategic decision to better govern the empire's heartland. But historians suspect it was more than mere logistics. It was a power play designed to sever ties with the entrenched aristocratic clans who had long dominated Chang'an's politics. For those caught within the gilded prison of Luoyang's imperial court, the city quickly became less a seat of power and more a furnace. a crucible where lives were burned and ambitions incinerated. Wu's cruelty here took on a dramatic flair worthy of a dark stage. One infamous victim was her own son-in-law, a man bold enough to question her authority. His fate was terrifyingly theatrical. Sentenced to be burned alive inside a massive bronze ox, an infernal device designed to roast victims slowly and mercilessly. Flames licked the metal shell as his agonized screams echoed, a gruesome warning to any who dared defy the Empress. Another official who dared a loud sigh, a simple human act, yet one fraught with implied dissent, suffered a fate equally cruel and symbolic. Wu ordered molten lead to be poured down his throat, a punishment both excruciating and emblematic of silencing discontent. Among the darkest tales from Luoyang is that of a pregnant concubine, condemned to a horror that blurs the line between myth and history. She was buried alive beneath a floor tile in the palace, the very ground the courtiers walked upon. The only mark of her grave was a tiny jade flower, so small and discreet that no one dared to step on it. Yet no one dared openly acknowledge it either. These acts did more than inflict physical pain. They cast a suffocating silence over the court. Fear was no longer expressed through cries or rebellion, but through an oppressive, chilling quiet. The sound of terror held tightly in every breath. Luoyang was not just a city. It was a furnace where Wu Zetian's ruthless will was forged, and where the souls of the fallen smoldered beneath the surface. Wu Zetian was not merely a ruler. She was a master manipulator of belief, wielding religion as both shield and sword in her relentless quest for power. Understanding that faith could inspire loyalty or ignite rebellion, she boldly declared herself the living incarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha destined to bring salvation. This was no mere vanity. It was a strategic claim to divine right, designed to place her above mortal reproach. Under her command, temples across the empire were ordered to rewrite their sacred scriptures. Ancient texts were altered to praise her as a messianic figure, a ruler sent by the heavens to restore order through iron will. One chilling revision replaced the humble phrase, "Blessed are the meek," with a sinister proclamation. Blessed are those who serve the Empress faithfully or die swiftly. Religious dissent was not an option, but a death sentence. In 694, Wu personally supervised the brutal punishment of 12 senior Buddhist scholars who dared to resist her divine claims. Their tongues were cruelly severed and nailed to the gates of their temples. A gruesome spectacle designed to silence not only their voices, but the very idea of opposition. This horrific act sent a message as clear as the clang of a temple bell at dawn. Faith was only safe when it reinforced the Empress's absolute rule. Some monks whispered secret prayers beneath their breath, hoping for mercy or divine intervention. Wu ensured those whispers were the last sounds they ever made. In the shadows of these sacred halls, terror had replaced hope. Religion had been twisted from a source of solace into a crown forged in blood and fear. Wu Zetian's merciless grasp spared no corner of her empire, not even the fragile bonds of family blood. In her court, loyalty was currency and power the only god. Family ties became threads to be severed without hesitation, sacrifices on the altar of absolute control. Her eldest son, Li Hong, stood out among the imperial offspring, known for his compassion and an unsettling curiosity about the fate of the many vanished ministers. Li Hong was a rare flicker of mercy in a ruthless court. But in Wu's brutal world, mercy was a deadly flaw. At the tender age of 23, Li Hong's life ended abruptly. Officially, it was illness, a vague, unchallenged cause, typical of palace records steeped in secrecy. Yet whispers in the dim corridors spoke of something far darker. A servant, long forgotten by history, recalled a bowl of porridge, suspiciously foul in smell, presented to the young prince before his sudden collapse. Poison, a whisper in the wind, a shadow behind a smile. The second son, Li Xian, was not so fortunate to die quietly. Accused of rebellion, charges as flimsy as the silks that adorned the palace halls. He was cast into exile, stripped of his princely privileges and forced to wander the empire's edges. His death was officially recorded as suicide, but this tale was told under the watchful eyes of 5 guards and 2 court scribes, witnesses to a performance where truth was scripted by power. No one doubted that the fatal act was anything but orchestrated. In a grim act of recycling names and scapegoats, Wu's 3rd son, also named Zetian, was thrust onto the throne. But he was no emperor in truth, merely a puppet draped in imperial robes, his strings pulled tightly by his mother's iron hand. Under Wu Zetian's reign, family was not a sanctuary. It was a battlefield. Brothers became threats, sons potential usurpers, daughters tools of alliance or pawns of court intrigue. In this savage theater, where every smile hid a knife and every embrace a betrayal, power alone commanded loyalty. Blood ties were fragile and often fatal. Amidst the relentless bloodshed and merciless intrigue of Wu Zetian's reign, a solitary figure moved quietly in the shadows. Princess Taiping, the Empress's only surviving daughter. More than just a royal heir, Taiping was a pupil in the darkest arts of power. From an early age, she was steeped in lessons that no academy dared teach. Intelligence and elegance masked a mind sharpened by cruelty and cunning. Taiping was not merely being prepared to inherit titles. She was being groomed to master fear, manipulation, and the subtle venom of poison, the silent weapons of survival and domination in the palace. Wu Zetian, paradoxically both a mother and a ruthless sovereign, entrusted Taiping with secrets and responsibilities far beyond her years. The princess was drawn into the web of court conspiracies, advised on deadly decisions, and trained to navigate a labyrinth where trust was fatal. But time, as it does, began to wear on Wu's iron grip. The Empress aged, and with her weakening power came growing murmurs of dissent, whispered rebellions behind velvet curtains. The secret police, those shadowy Northgate scholars, once so fearsome, grew uneasy, their silence trembling with anticipation. Even the gods Wu proclaimed to embody seemed to fall silent, their divine voices absent from the chaos. In this shifting storm, Taiping played a different role, that of the careful observer and strategist. She made frequent, discreet visits to the palace apothecaries, watching her mother's diet with clinical attention, recommending new herbal tonics with an eye both maternal and calculating. These actions were more than care. They were preparation for the inevitable passage of power. For in the Wu family, power was never guaranteed by birth alone. It was a legacy forged in shadows, passed down through silence, fear, and when necessary, poison. Taiping knew this well. She was learning not just to survive, but to inherit a throne soaked in blood and shaped by dread. The shadows of the palace grew heavier with each passing day, as Wu Zetian's reign plunged deeper into a realm where human suffering was both spectacle and weapon. The story of her cruelty, far from being mere whispers in history, becomes a vivid panorama of horror. Tortures meticulously designed to break bodies and spirits alike, deaths that echoed with chilling finality, in an empire ruled by fear and blood. The bronze ox, a furnace of agony. Among the darkest and most chilling instruments of torture associated with Wu Zetian's reign was the infamous bronze ox, a device designed not just to execute, but to prolong suffering, to turn death into a spectacle of slow agony. Constructed entirely of bronze, the ox was hollow, large enough to imprison a man, yet claustrophobic enough to confine him tightly. The exterior was shaped like an ox, symbolizing strength and endurance, but inside, it was a furnace, a chamber of unbearable heat and despair. The condemned victim was forced into the narrow interior, where escape was impossible. Once sealed inside, the bronze ox was placed over an open fire, which was gradually stoked, causing the metal to heat slowly but relentlessly. Unlike swift executions, This torture was engineered for prolonged pain. The heat would seep through the thick bronze walls, burning the prisoner's skin, causing blistering and searing flesh. The victim's lungs would fill with hot, suffocating air, turning each breath into a torture itself. Over hours, the prisoner would feel the gradual roasting of muscles, the unbearable heat slowly breaking body and will. The sound were a haunting element of this horror. The ox's bronze surface would amplify the muffled screams and cries, echoing through the palace halls as a grim warning to anyone who dared cross Zetian. Historical accounts, while sparse and sometimes mixed with legend, describe the device as a symbol of Wu's merciless justice, not merely to punish, but to terrify. It served as a powerful reminder that defiance would be met with unimaginable suffering, that the Empress's wrath could turn even the strongest into helpless victims. The use of the bronze ox was a terrifying theatricality, cruelty elevated to an art form, meant to consolidate power by instilling paralyzing fear in the hearts of courtiers and rivals alike. Zetian's palace, in these moments, was less a royal residence and more a stage of nightmares, where the slow-burning furnace of the bronze ox was a centerpiece of terror. Zetian's reign thrived not only on visible brutality, but also on psychological domination, where even the slightest sign of dissent could provoke a lethal response. One such chilling episode involves an official whose fatal mistake was nothing more than a human reaction, a sigh. In the tense atmosphere of the imperial court, where every gesture was scrutinized and paranoia reigned supreme, a sigh could be interpreted as contempt, dissatisfaction, or rebellion. During one of Wu's public addresses, an official audibly exhaled a heavy breath, a moment of weariness or disbelief perhaps, but in a court ruled by terror, this small act became a death sentence. Zetian, known for her cold, calculated ruthlessness, responded not with immediate violence, but with a calm that masked deadly intent. The official was soon condemned, not through a fair trial or concrete evidence, but on the basis of perceived disrespect. His punishment was as symbolic as it was excruciating. He was forced to swallow molten lead, a horrifying execution method that combined agonizing physical pain with a grim finality. The molten metal poured slowly down his throat, burned through flesh and bone, sealing his fate in a manner both cruel and profoundly silencing. This punishment was a message to all courtiers. Disobedience, or even the hint of dissent, would be crushed utterly and without mercy. The physical agony was only part of the terror. It was the psychological impact, the knowledge that even a breath, a sigh, could provoke such brutal retribution, that kept the court in a state of fearful obedience. Legends passed down among palace servants whispered a cruel phrase: "Better to choke on your fear than on your phlegm." This dark proverb encapsulated the oppressive atmosphere Wu cultivated, where survival depended on mastering silence and suppressing even the most instinctive reactions. Thus, the molten lead punishment was not only an execution, but a theatrical display of power, reminding all who served the Empress that their lives were fragile, their fates tied to the smallest acts of compliance. Among the most haunting and grisly tales from Zetian's reign is the story of a pregnant concubine condemned to a fate both cruel and surreal, being buried alive beneath the palace floor. This concubine was no mere victim of palace intrigue. Her punishment was a deliberate act of terror, designed to silence not only her, but the very idea of dissent. The reason for her condemnation is lost to history, shrouded in rumors and whispers, but the method of her death speaks volumes about the ruthlessness of Wu's rule. Rather than a public execution, which might have sparked sympathy or rebellion, Wu chose a fate that was silent and invisible, a slow death beneath the feet of unsuspecting courtiers. The concubine was interred alive beneath a floor tile in the palace, condemned to suffocate in darkness, her life extinguished inch by inch. The only mark of her grave was a small jade flower, delicately placed to identify the spot. This token was so subtle that it was almost invisible to the eye, a secret known only to a few trusted servants. Palace residents dared neither to step on it nor to acknowledge it openly, as if the mere recognition of the grave might invite misfortune. The image is chilling. Life crushed beneath the weight of power, a living burial that symbolized the utter control Wu exerted over life and death, presence and absence. It was a punishment not just of the body, but of memory, an attempt to erase a person so completely that even her death became a secret. In the oppressive atmosphere of Wu's court, where every whisper might be heard and every shadow could conceal a spy, this act of burial alive was a stark message. Power was absolute, and disobedience was buried before it could be voiced. This story, while partly mythic and partly documented in scattered historical sources, endures as a testament to the extremes of Wu Zetian's cruelty, a reign where horror was often hidden in silence, and the most terrifying punishments were those invisible to the eye. Wu Zetian's reign was not sustained solely through brutal public executions and hidden murders. Beneath the visible cruelty lay an even more insidious apparatus of control, the secret police, known as the North Gate Scholars. This elite group of spies and informants was a cornerstone of Wu's systematic reign of terror, transforming paranoia into a weapon. Far from the blatant spectacles of torture, these agents operated in shadows, using fear and suspicion to maintain order. They were scholars turned spies, trained not only to observe but to fabricate, to create evidence where none existed, and to turn whispers into accusations. Their methods were chillingly effective. They planted forged documents, including bamboo slips inscribed with treasonous poetry, beneath officials' pillows. Letters were intercepted and altered. In some accounts, they even disguised themselves as ghosts, haunting the corridors at night, to frighten nobles into confessing crimes they never committed. The psychological torment inflicted by these tactics was profound. One story tells of a courtier accused of plotting regicide simply because his slippers were found misaligned, a perceived symbolic insult to the throne. The servant who reported this minor offense likely did so under orders or for personal gain, but the consequences were deadly. This culture of suspicion meant that no one was truly safe, not even those closest to the Empress. Fear of betrayal and denunciation permeated the court, creating an environment where trust was impossible and silence was often the only means of survival. The secret police enforced Wu's absolute rule, not just by removing enemies, but by creating a society in which dissent was suffocated before it could arise. Their presence was a constant, invisible threat, a reminder that eyes were everywhere and loyalty was measured in fear. Wu Zetian's system of terror was, in many ways, a dark precursor to modern surveillance states, where control is maintained not only through force but through the manipulation of truth and the omnipresence of watchers. This psychological battlefield was perhaps even more effective than any physical torture, as it left the courtiers imprisoned within their own minds, haunted by doubts, suspicions, and the ever-present possibility of a whispered accusation. Wu Zetian's brutal reign spared no one, not even those bound to her by blood. Within the imperial family, suspicion, betrayal, and death wove a dark tapestry of tragedy and treachery. Her sons, once potential heirs to the throne, became victims of the lethal politics that defined her rule. Her eldest son, Li Hong, was known among the court for his gentleness and his troubling curiosity about the fate of the many ministers who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. These traits, while noble, marked him as a threat in Wu's eyes. At the young age of 23, Li Hong died suddenly, with official accounts attributing his death to illness. However, palace rumors spoke of a bowl of porridge, one that smelled strange, served with malicious intent. Poison, many believed, had silenced the young prince before he could challenge his mother's iron grip. Her second son, Li Xian, faced an even darker fate, accused of plotting rebellion, a charge often leveled without evidence in Wu's court. He was stripped of his titles and exiled. His death was recorded as a suicide, but the circumstances raised many questions. How could one hang himself under the watchful eyes of 5 guards and 2 scribes without intervention? The scene suggested a carefully orchestrated assassination disguised as self-inflicted demise, a theatrical act of political murder. The story of Wu's third son, also named Zetian, a peculiar recycling of names, perhaps reflecting a ruthless pragmatism, is no less grim. Installed as emperor under his mother's regency, he was little more than a puppet, adorned with a crown but lacking true power. His reign symbolized Wu's ultimate control, even over her own flesh and blood. Within this poisoned kinship, loyalty was a fragile commodity. Family ties were secondary to the relentless pursuit of power. The throne was a prize bathed in blood, and the Empress's sons were both heirs and victims to a cruel legacy. Wu Zetian's rule thus redefined family, not as a sanctuary, but as another battlefield where survival depended on cunning, silence, and a willingness. The princess learns, legacy of silence and poison. Amidst the blood-soaked corridors and whispered betrayals of Wu Zetian's court, one figure quietly absorbed the lessons of power, cruelty, and survival. Princess Taiping, Wu's only surviving daughter. Unlike many royal daughters, Taiping was not merely a passive witness to her mother's reign of terror. She was a student of it, intelligent, observant, and shaped by the brutal realities of palace life. From a young age, Wu entrusted her with secrets, involving her in the intricate web of court intrigues and decisions. Taiping learned that power was not just wielded through force, but through fear, manipulation, and sometimes the silent efficiency of poison. As Wu aged, her once iron grip began to loosen. Rumors of dissent grew louder, and even the secret police found themselves restless in the shifting tides of court politics. The gods Wu claimed to embody, the divine mantle that legitimized her rule, grew silent, offering no comfort or answers. During these uncertain times, Taiping increased her visits to the palace apothecaries, watching her mother's diet with careful attention, suggesting herbal concoctions that might sustain or even prolong Wu's life. But beneath this surface of filial concern lay a deeper understanding. Power in the Wu family was a legacy not merely inherited through blood, but passed through silence, strategy, and the lethal precision of unseen weapons. The whispered lessons of poison and betrayal were not lost on her. Taiping was preparing patiently and methodically to inherit not just a throne, but a throne maintained by shadows. In the Wu dynasty, power was a poisonous gift, a throne secured by silence, fear, and the ever-present threat of death.